Okay, so now we have our mat all cut and we're gonna start our binding. And before we do, I wanna talk to you a little bit about the difference between bias binding and straight grain binding. I'm actually gonna let you look at the back or the wrong side of our fabric piece here, because you can kind of see the way that this fabric is woven. So that is, when fabric is woven, we have all these threads going this way, and we have all these threads going this way. So these are considered the straight grain of the fabric. Now, a lot of quilt books or quilt instructions will say if you have a quilt that has a straight edge, then you should just cut a straight grain binding. And if you have a wavy or a scalloped edge, then you should use a bias binding. But I want to talk a little bit about the difference between those two things. Let's pretend that this is our binding. If we fold our fabric over, and so here's our binding, and if this was actually right on the edge of the quilt, if we have threads going this way and we have threads going this way, technically speaking, right along the edge of our binding is one thread, because that's how these are being woven. But if we turn this on the bias, now the bias is basically anything that is not that straight grain. So anything off that straight grain is considered bias. A true bias would be a 45-degree angle. And so let's say now this is the edge of our binding. If we turn this on the bias, now we have threads going this way and this way. And so right on the edge of our quilt, we have a way stronger edge to that quilt than if we just had that straight grain binding. The other advantage to bias binding is the look. Just sometimes you can kind of see the grain in that fabric. In my opinion, I think that bias, those bias threads are just a little bit more pleasing to the eye. And then sometimes you might be working with a stripe or a plaid fabric, and that always looks really nice on the bias versus that straight grain. And then as you'll see when we're applying the binding to the quilt, a bias edge, now this is going to be the actual stretchiest part of our piece of fabric, but this bias edge, because it has that give, it just seems to just adhere and lay nicer to the edge of the quilt. So obviously this is my preference, but sometimes maybe the amount of fabric that you have is a factor. If you just have a small piece of fabric left, then of course I would cut that binding on that straight grain, right? Because you don't want a bunch of short little bias strips sewn together with lots of seams. And then sometimes your project is going to lend itself to a straight grain binding. Maybe it's a table runner or something, a wall hanging. And so you always have to just kind of think of what your project is and what kind of binding you want to make. Okay, so now we are going to make our binding. Now, one thing I like about this technique is that we can use a rectangle. This is basically the size of a fat quarter of fabric, and I have pre-pressed and starched this, and that just kind of gives it a little bit more stability. A lot of techniques will have you use an exact square, and I like the fact that we can use a rectangle with this technique. There are several other techniques out there for preparing a bias binding, and I think that's great that we have options. I would just research that a little bit, find the one that you like and use that one. This one is my favorite. So like I said, I have pre-pressed this fabric. I have cut the selvage off the edge, and I am going to have this rectangle. Here's the length, and here, well, I guess this would be the width and the length. Okay, let's say that again. Here's the long end of this, and here's the short end. That's probably the easiest to understand. I'm going to take, if I'm standing in front of it, I'm going to take the bottom left-hand corner, and I'm going to bring that up, and I am going to have this edge be, not quite a half, maybe 3/8 of an inch higher than the cut edge of this back side. So I'm having that come up just a little bit above that, and that's going to make sense in the next step. Okay, so after we have folded this up, and this is about 3/8 of an inch above this back cut line. Then we're going to take this and move it over to the pressing board. Now what I want you to remember is that now this fold is on the bias. And remember how we talked about how that bias is very stretchy. So when I bring the iron to this, I'm going to press. Now there's a difference between pressing and ironing. If I iron it across this way, it's just going to stretch out that bias fold. So I'm going to press this, slide this down. This might be something that I would take over to the bigger ironing board. But see what a nice job my little travel iron does on this. Okay, so now let's come back here so this looks the same. All right, so now after I have folded that up, I pressed this down. We're going to open it up. Basically what we've done is we have just pressed our cutting line. Now, you don't have to lay a ruler on here and be that accurate, but I'm going to. You don't have to. You could just follow that line. I guess if you do want to be a little more accurate, you are going to cut that with a ruler. Okay, so now this is a little bit of the tricky part because these two pieces look quite a bit the same. And so it always helps me to kind of do it the same every single time I make binding. After you have folded that and pressed it, you are going to lift this piece up and bring it over to here. So these two edges are now going to be sewn together. Okay, I want to just show you one more time. Because the tendency is to turn this or flip it, but you aren't turning it over, you're just lifting it straight up, moving it over. Let's move that so you can see it a little bit better. And now we're going to sew this edge together. Now one thing I want you to look at before we pin this and sew it together is that this cut line right here is on the straight grain. And there's a couple ways that you can tell. You can actually look and see the grain of the fabric pretty well in this one. The other thing is notice how this edge is fraying. So when you have a piece of fabric and that edge has the tendency to fray, that is going to be the edge of a straight grain. If you look over on this bias edge, right, where we cut that along the bias, there's no fraying along that bias edge. So that gives you a nice visual that you actually have the two correct edges together. And so we're going to put these right sides together. And it kind of looks a little bit like makes it look like a flag. Now the reason, you remember when we folded up that left-hand corner? The reason we folded up that left-hand corner a little bit above that line is it gives us a seam line. You can see right here where we have a little bit of extra space. It's not cut right to a point. So that's why we folded that up above that line, because that gives us just a little bit of extra space for the sewing part. So I'm going to put a couple of pins in here for good measure. And lining these up. The other thing that I like to do is when I am sewing my bias together, I like to lower the stitch length on the sewing machine just a little bit. So if you like to piece, let's say you like to piece with a 2.5 stitch length, then I'm going to lower this stitch length to a 2.0. So just one little notch lower or closer together or tighter than you would normally sew with. Now we have put the 1/4 inch piecing foot on our sewing machine. We're going to line that up right along the edge, but this actually brings up another good point. When we are piecing a quilt together, we are very focused on the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's a very important part of piecing a quilt. But when you're sewing your binding together, we're actually more interested in having a nice stable seam. I'm using a 1/4 inch piecing foot, but actually what I'm sewing is a nice generous 1/4 inch seam. This is not a place where I would want to do a scant 1/4 inch seam, because what I want is a real nice strong seam. So we're gonna go ahead and sew that. See how it just takes a little bit longer? Seems like it's not going quite as fast. I don't like to, I think it's a rule to not sew over pins, or maybe that's just a home ec rule. I just don't like sewing over pins. So we're gonna line up those raw edges, and we're gonna sew those two pieces together. There's really no need to backstitch at this point, especially since we did a little bit tighter seam. Okay, so now after we have sewn these two together, I'm gonna fold this way so we can kind of have this visual. Just, it makes me feel smarter just saying that we have created a parallelogram. And the next thing we wanna do is press this seam open. And again, this might be something I would do, well, no, I would probably do it on a little pressing board. I really like the control that we get with a small iron. I kind of just like to soften up those edges, and then I'm gonna slide that little point in there, and I'm just gonna flatten this seam. Now there are a couple of different rules of thumb when you are sewing your binding together. I have heard one that says to press both seams over to one side, because then on the other side that your seam is not exposed. But what I like to do is I like to do a shorter stitch length, just like we just did. I do a little bit tighter stitch length, and so my seam is just a much stronger seam. And so I don't worry that that seam is going to be exposed. Now the other thing I do at this point is I turn this over, and I like to press on this right side of the fabric because I want to make sure that this seam is really flat. No bubbles. Oh, that looks good. Okay, so now this part of creating our bias strips. Now we're going to make bias strips out of this. And to me, this is kind of visual. And there's just a few things that you need to remember during this part. We're going to look at our parallelogram, and when we're looking at this, we want the points to be going north and south, or towards us and away from us. That's how we want to see this. The other thing that we're going to see is that the bias edges are east and west. And again, the way you can tell that this is a bias edge is that this is not going to fray. You can kind of tell by the weave of the fabric. And so that bias edge is going to be east and west. The points are going to be north and south, or pointing away and towards us. And then we're going to fold this up. I kind of look at it like kind of like a bed roll, or if you've made a cinnamon roll, and we are going to fold it up that way. I don't know if that most of us are women, but we have we want to fold it up like a diaper, and so we're not going to do that. We are going to always match these bias edges together, and we're just going to keep rolling it up. The other thing that I like is if you roll this up on a cutting mat, then I can kind of judge that this roll is even on both sides. And so rather than keep rolling it this way, I'm just going to bring this one down. So we are matching up these bias edges. We're going to tuck this. I'll flip it, and we'll just tuck that. And get that thread out of the way. So now you have this nice little roll. It's basically the same length here and here. So I know that this is nice and even. Just double check yourself and make sure that this is the bias edge here. If there's any fraying on these edges, then you probably folded it up like a diaper. And so I would start again. Okay, now once this is all rolled up, we have to decide how wide are we going to cut our bias strips. Now, most quilt books or instructions will just say to cut it at 2.5 inches. But I want to show you just a little test that has saved me lots and lots of tears actually, because nothing is worse than finishing cutting out all your binding and sewing it on the edge of your quilt and wishing it had been just a little bit wider or a little bit more narrow. And so before I cut out my strips, I'm going to show you a little trick that I do. Most quilt patterns or books will tell you when it comes to binding to just cut a 2.5 inch strip. And so what I do, this is actually a 2.5 inch square, which works great. I'm going to pretend that this is the width of my binding, and I'm going to fold this in half. I can press it just to really get a good register of this is what my binding is going to be. And then I put it, we're going to use the pocket, but I'm going to put this on the edge of my quilt. Now, most of the quilts that I make are going to have cotton on the front. I usually use thinner cotton batting, and then I'll have cotton on the back. But this little tip especially helps. Maybe you're going to do a quilt that has minky on the back. You know, minky is thicker and has a lot more to it. Or maybe you're going to use a double layer of batting. So different quilts may have different things than just your typical quilt sandwich. So I take this little piece, fold it in half, and I actually take the time to bring it over to the sewing machine. And because I don't want this to stay on here forever, I'm going to lengthen my stitch length probably to a 3.5, so a little bit longer. I don't want it to be a long basting stitch. I'm going to sew this on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Yeah, lengthen my stitch length, and I'm just, basically what I'm doing is I'm just tacking this little piece on. But this technique or this little tip works way better to actually sew it on the quilt rather than just pinning it on. You get a lot better visual. So after it's tacked on the quilt, then I'm going to just fold it around to the back, and I can see my stitching right here that I have sewn, and I'm going to see if I'm going to hand sew my binding down, then I want my binding to just barely cover up that stitching. If I'm going to machine sew the binding down, like I'm going to show you a little bit later, then I want my binding to go 1/8 of an inch at least past that stitch line, and this does. Now, another thing that we're trying to accomplish when we bind a quilt is we would like to have a binding that is full of quilt. We don't want to have a lot of extra space in our binding, and so that's another factor, that's another problem that this little tip solves every single time. And so for this project, I'm going to go ahead and cut a 2.5 inch wide binding, and I think it's going to work just great. Now I want to show you one other thing. In our project today, right, because I'm demoing right here on our pocket, so on our project today, we're actually, technically, we've got 2 quilts. We have 2 quilt pieces that this binding needs to go over. So for this project, I would sew this on, just one of the pieces, and then we're going to wrap this around. And since we don't have a stitch line to see, then what I'm going to do is grab a pin, and I'm going to poke that pin right here in the ditch, and let's see where it ends up. See that? So we have plenty of room that this will be machine sewn down, and our binding is nice and full of quilt, but that 2.5 inch is going to be plenty for this project. So I'm going to go ahead and cut our binding strips at 2.5 inches for today. And then you could just easily unpick this because we don't want that to be on there. All right, so let's come back to our nice little roll of our bias binding. You're going to take the ruler and your rotary cutter. I like to line the bottom edge of this. Let's call this our binding roll here. I like to have the bottom edge basically lined up along a straight line, so I know that the grain is going to be good. Put some glasses on. Now, do you see how this left edge isn't perfectly straight and even? So as you're folding this up, I don't want you to worry so much about that, because now we are ready to cut, and we're going to put the ruler over the top of this, and we're just going to clean up this edge. So I'm cutting off, not even quite 1/4 of an inch. And now we're going to start cutting our 2.5 inch strips. Sometimes there are different things you can do on your ruler to mark that 2.5 inch strip. There are little strips of kind of a sticky tape that you can put on there. So you know how we like to collect things as quilters, and I actually have a ruler at home that is just marked for my binding. And so whenever I'm cutting my binding strips, I grab that ruler and I have that perfect mark every single time. So 2.5 inch strips all the way across, and not very much waste at the end, which is always good. Okay, so now we have our bias strips. Now another thing I like about this technique is that when we connect our ends, I'm going to show you how we're going to sew these together. When we connect these ends together, they're going to be sewn right sides together, and we're going to overlap these points a little bit. And again, this kind of goes back to, remember when I was talking about taking that nice full 1/4 inch seam? That rule also applies to when we're sewing those binding strips together. This does not need to be a scant. We want a nice strong seam when we're sewing these bias strips together. So I'm going to kind of point this out, maybe with my scissors here. So where you're going to be sewing is, I call this from valley to valley. So do you see how this creates a little valley when you overlap? We're going to be sewing from valley to valley. Now, one thing that you can do if you would like is you can, now this is kind of a big ruler to demonstrate this, but it's going to work. Just if you would like to, you can put that ruler from valley to valley and just mark this with your marking pen. And so basically that's just going to mark your sew line, so then you don't have to worry. I don't know about you, but sometimes it's hard to actually sew a straight line. And then you're going to pin these together, so you're matching these raw edges back up. We're going to pin these together, and then we're going to go sew. Oh, let me get that back where it's supposed to be. That's another good reason to mark that before you sew it, because that tells you exactly where that was supposed to be lined up. Okay, then we're going to bring this over and sew it. Now, again, this goes back to when we were sewing this, our parallelogram. I'm going to shorten my stitch length, probably down to a 2.0, a little bit tighter stitch than I would normally do. Let's go here, and we're going to sew right on this line that we marked. Oop, look at those raw edges together. And I just have to say, it's really fun to have a sewing machine that is going to cut your threads for you. Okay, and so now the reason why we overlapped these when we sewed this seam is, look what happens when this opens up. See how we've created a nice straight line here. The other thing that I wanted to mention, after you've cut all your strips and you have all these, I like to find the strip that has that seam kind of closest to the end. Because one thing I want to try to avoid is sewing strips together where I'm going to have seams either right on top of each other or really close to each other. So this particular strip that has a seam right here close to the end, I'm going to have that at the beginning or the ending of my binding strip. And the next thing that we're going to do is bring this over, and we are going to press, let me turn it this way, it'll be a little easier. We're going to press these raw edges together. Now this is another thing that I guess the reason why I like to do this is it just makes this binding strip so much easier to manage. I used to think that it didn't make a difference, and then I actually folded them together and pressed them, and it made it so much easier. And so the other thing to remember is that this is a bias. So again, we do not want to iron back and forth. We want to really focus on pressing, and we want to match up these raw edges. In fact, let me turn it over this way. I can see those raw edges a little better. So we want to match up these raw edges. We want to press this. And we're going to continue sewing all of our strips together and pressing these raw edges together. And then it will be all ready for sewing it on the quilt.